I realised that the reason this was taking me so long to record is that there's like 2 off-ramps onto big rants that I like to have about this stuff. And I didn't know how long I was going to rant for. So this is basically me caveating again that I'm probably going to yell about something. I'm going to try not to do it too long. I'm going to try not to do it too passionately, but I apologise. Honesty, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelittales YouTube channel, where we tell Irish mythology set to music on our podcast and also talk about all things Irish mythology. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Irish King of the Gods, or at least one of the Irish Kings of the Gods, because as with all things Irish mythology, it's complicated. There are several kings in Irish mythology. I get given out to in the comments sometimes by people being like, this video doesn't start for 5 minutes because there's a million caveats first. So this is your first caveat, and then I'm not going to talk about how muddy the sources are because I've talked about it before and you can find it in another video. I'll get straight to the point, almost. The first point being, there is not a single static king of the gods in Irish mythology. There are a multitude. Because when we're talking about the Irish gods, we're mostly talking about the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are the magical godlike people, the Tuatha or the Tuatha Dé Danann, who came to Ireland as the third or fourth group of invaders in the Lara Gabhála, or the Book of Invasions, which tells the stories of the different peoples who came to the island. There were a lot of kings, there were a lot of people, there were a lot of original people, and, you know, when you're looking for a clean, clear pantheon, that's going to be your first hurdle, is that there's not a clean, clear pantheon and there's not a clean, clear hierarchy. Because these were mythologies that arose out of a culture that had itself a very flexible hierarchy, as reflected in the Brehon laws that we have from like medieval and ancient Ireland. This was not a static hierarchy. This was a flexible hierarchy. There was a huge degree of social mobility. And so the mythology reflected that. There were kings who succeeded other kings, who passed on power to other kings. There was a king called Nuada Aragat Nuada of the Silver Arm. There was a king called Bov Darug. There was Ochalochny. There was lots of different kings. And probably the best known of them, the one who is the most referenced, and the one that I'm going to talk about today, the one who's mostly agreed as being the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, in as much as there was a singular one, the Dagda. So who is the Dagda? The name Dagda, or Dagda, means good god. And I think that gives people a little bit of an idea about this sort of wise, bearded, white-haired, sitting on a cloud kind of guy. And I want you to get that right out of your head, because a better translation is probably excellent god, because it wasn't about him being morally good. It was about him being excellent at things. He's a god of skill, and he's a god of talent, and he's a many-talented god, he's not the only one who's a bit of an all-rounder. But, you know, you look at characters like Lugh, who also is a wonderful master of all. But the Dagda got this name from the first battle of Moytura. After everybody else listed out all of the things they were going to do for the Tuatha Dé Danann, he basically stood up and said, I'll do all of that because I can do all of that. So as well as being a warrior, craftsman, he was a hospitaller. That's the kind of role that he's often given in the myths and in the stories, of like somebody who throws the feast and holds the entertainment and the generosity and the welcome for everybody else, which was a huge virtue in ancient Ireland. This idea of being like endlessly generous and hospitable. He was a negotiator. Not always a successful negotiator, but he was a negotiator. He was skilled at everything. And one of the things he was skilled at was lovemaking, which we're going to get into in a minute. But first, I have to say, the Dagda, because he's one of the more well-known gods in Irish mythology, he's also probably one of the more fantasized about, if not the most fantasized about, in a way that I gotta admit is a little bit of a button for me. I don't want to talk about this without addressing it, and I'm going to try not to just froth incoherently about how much it annoys me, and actually get to the meat of why this bothers me, why I think people do it, and what I think a better way to think about this stuff. So because he's so well known, because he has this title of the good God. And I think because people like this idea of having like a top of the heap father god that can be correlated with all of the other top of the heap paternalistic father gods in world mythology, a lot of stuff gets hung on the Dagda that has nothing to do with anything. I have seen stories, this is probably one of the more popular genres of completely fabricated Irish myths, are creation myths. And that's frequently the Dagda, who is attributed to the creation of Ireland, often hand in hand with his wife, Bridget, who's not his wife. She's his daughter, but she's well known, especially under the saint identity. And so people just pair them off, ship them, father and daughter, and have them calling Ireland up out of the waves. I also saw something not that long ago, somebody sent it to me on Instagram, a reinterpretation of the solstice at Newgrange as being an artistic representation of Dagda and Boann making love at midwinter in order to bring the sun back into the land, which just kind of bummed me out, because it casts Dagda as a sky god. He's not a sky god. He doesn't have anything to do with the sky. And it casts Boann as Earth Mother, and it's this like, and it also puts them like the absolute wonder of the world that is Newgrange, where the rising sun on the winter solstice penetrates to the back wall of the burial chamber. That was not made by people who told stories about Dagda and Bridget. That was not made. The builders of that passage tomb died out in Ireland. And the people who told stories about the Dagda and Bridget came later. We don't know what stories they told about the passage tomb. We have no idea if it has anything to do with a symbolic sexual thing. People like to think that. Sure, maybe, but we have no idea. And I think the other reason it bugs me is that there's just this tendency with mythology to look for patterns, which is very human, and we all do it. And especially when we're learning a new thing, it can be really useful to be able to connect dots and kind of go, okay, well, Neptune is here and Poseidon is here and Mannanon is here and they're all sea deities, and let's see what they have in common, right? It's fine as far as that goes, especially if you then like dive into the nuance of the different personalities that those three sea deities that I just pulled off the top of my head are. But what people do a lot, and what people do a lot on the internet, and not just on the internet, books do this too. I have seen books that do this and they make me angry, is that you get this kind of overextension of those links, and you get this reach for consistency under the guise of like looking for common archetypes or looking for commonalities. You get this sort of flattening and smushing together of stuff in order to make it less challenging and less interesting and less textured. And to me, it is like putting a bunch of different cuisines into a blender and pressing a button and then thinking you did something clever, because it just sucks all of the nuance and all of the magic and all of the interest and diversity and reduces it into this kind of like pan-pagan slop that then becomes palatable and easy to digest and unchallenging. And I hate it so much, it makes me angry. And I want to say, if you're someone who is sitting here and going, oh no, I read that story about the Dagda and Bridget and I thought it was really beautiful and meaningful, this round is not directed at you. You are presumably watching this video because you're interested in this topic and you want to know more about it. And it's not your fault if somebody gave you bad information. I'm not trying to say like, no, leave them behind a glass case. Never touch the mythology. Leave the Dagda alone. The Dagda is fine. But I wish people knew him a little better. And I wish people just respected world mythology enough not to flatten it and reduce it into something unchallenging and bland and sad, because that makes me sad. I think the rant is over. So the Dagda did not create Ireland. He didn't call it up out of the waves. He came to Ireland as one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and they came 37 years after the Firbolg came to Ireland, who were themselves the third group of people, or second, depending on how you count it. As I said at the beginning, it's complicated. Second or third group of people to come to Ireland. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought a war with the Firbolg because they wanted to initially divide the island, and the Firbolg said no. It had been their island for 37 years and they weren't giving it up. And the Firbolg, at the First Battle of Moytura, defeated the Tuatha Dé Danann king. They severed the arm of Nuada, and although they were hopelessly outnumbered, they kind of rallied to make a wonderful last stand under their champion Shreng. And that's when the Dagda took over. The Dagda stood up, took command of the army, and the first thing that he did was he made peace. And to that small, valiant corps of Firbolg who had refused to surrender, he offered them the province of Connacht, which was not quite the division that had initially been proposed, but was close enough. And he made peace between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbolg, which I think is kind of an indication of the kind of personality that the Dagda has, right? He's a skillful warrior. He's very good at it, but fundamentally, this is somebody with enough wisdom to see when the killing needs to stop. His story takes a little bit of a dark turn after that, because under the kingship of Bress the Beautiful, the Dagda suffered terribly. He was given hard labour to do by Bress, and he was underfed. One of the qualities of the Dagda, and a quality that you get in a lot of the great heroes in Irish myth, is this kind of idea of the prodigious appetite, like him being a strong, powerful person who needs a lot of food and eats a lot of food and has like great vigorous appetites in food and also in sex, which we're going to get to in a minute. And Bress confined him to a household full of idle, blind people and forced the Dagda to share his rations with them so that he was never getting enough food. And it was only after Bress was overthrown and the second battle of Moytura was fought that the Dagda was kind of back on top. And sometime after that, he became the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Now, there's a little bit of a tendency to describe the Dagda as being a little bit of a buffoonish character, and I think a lot of that came a good bit later. This idea of him being like big and strong and kind of fat and jolly. I'm not sure that he's that soft in the original myths. He's quite a serious warrior, but I think he does have these like slightly buffoonish characteristics in some of the stories. In this story, before the second battle of Moytura, he went to try and negotiate peace with the Fomorians, who were this sort of undersea enemies of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He tried to negotiate with them, and they dug a pit and filled it with food and demanded that he eat it, or else be in violation of their hospitality, which was both an insult to the Dagda and also kind of a mockery of the custom of hospitality that was really important in the stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann and, you know, really important to the Irish people who told stories about them. And so the Dagda defiantly carved his own spoon and ate all of this sort of disgusting gruel that they had made for him, even scraping down the sides of the pit and eating the gravel. And then on the way home, seduced a Fomorian princess and got her to fight on his side, because that's the kind of guy he was. I think he had to throw up into the waves at one point, though. We'll hope that there was a good gap between the vomiting and the seducing the princess. Family tree-wise, the Dagda has quite a lot of children linked to him, and he is married. He's married, interestingly, to the Morrigan, the battle crow herself, and we have an explainer about her on the channel. I do remember that one. But he was not a faithful husband. I don't think that was a particularly important virtue in ancient Ireland. There's a lot of stuff in the Brehon laws about taking second wives and things like that. He got around a whole lot. So a lot of the children attributed to the Dagda are not necessarily attributed to the Morrigan. Probably his most famous child after Bridget, who again is mostly known through the saint that took the name of the goddess, who's quite a minor character in the second battle of Moytura, was Angus Og. We also have an explainer about him. Angus Og was conceived by the Dagda and Boann, goddess of the River Boyne, while she was married to somebody else. Her husband was out hunting, and the two of them met on the hillside, and the Dagda played music to the sun to get it to stay in the sky for a year and a day, so they had a year and a day to conceive Angus Og, who was conceived and carried and born in a day. Other notable family, he had a daughter called Anya. He had a daughter called Bridget. One of his rather famous sons was Medir. Medir fostered the Dagda's son Angus, and he is the centre of a very famous Irish love story that starts with infidelity and heartbreak, because there's no such thing as an uncomplicated Irish love story. Both Darragh is kind of a well-known king, Tuatha Dé Danann king of Munster, and was the sort of she king of Munster after the division between the world and the other world, between Ireland and the other world, when all of the Tuatha Dé Danann went under the Sidhe because the Gaels arrived. Anya, sovereignty goddess of Munster. There's a story about her on our podcast. It's not for the faint of heart. Listen to the trigger warnings. Some of the more interesting stories about the Dagda and some of the more interesting aspects of the Dagda have to do with his items, his artefacts. Because the Dagda has 3 big important sort of objects. One I mentioned already, and that is the Dagda's harp. He played it to the sun to keep the sun in the sky for a year while he and Boann dallied. That harp was also said to influence the seasons to change and influence the weather. And it was also able to play any emotion into the hearts of its listeners. So the 3 sort of main strains of Irish music, and this is true in Irish trad to this day, are strains of laughter, weeping and sleep. And there's a very famous story about this, or at least a story that I feel is famous because I've told it so many times and we've told it on the podcast a few times, about the Dagda's harp being stolen after the Second Battle of Moytura. He, Lugh and Ogma had to go off and find it and bring it back, and he got it back by playing through those strains to the Fomorian army who had stolen it, first making them all laugh hysterically and then making them all weep brokenheartedly before finally putting them all to sleep. He's also very famously associated with a club that can kill with one end and resurrect with the other end. This is one that he acquired when he was on a quest for his son Kermit, who was killed by Lugh. The essence of it is that his son Kermit was killed and the Dagda went away to find a means of resurrecting him. I have also found a fragment of a story where the Dagda was like walking along the road and saw 10 men coming towards him dragging this enormous heavy club. And he asked if he could pick it up, and they kind of laughed at him, not thinking he'd be able to. So he picked it up with ease because he's the Dagda, and found out that if he hit these guys with one end of it, they dropped dead. And if he hit them with the other end of it, they got back up again. So with very little persuasion, they gave him the club and didn't bring it to whatever presumed hero or evil creature it was actually supposed to go to. So he kind of stole it. It's also kind of a very obvious phallic symbol, the life-giving club and the death-dealing club. And the other one that he has, which I think is really interesting, is that he has the Cauldron of Plenty. This is one of the great treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and it's in the keeping of the Dagda, which kind of goes to his whole thing about hospitality and generosity, because this was a cauldron that was never empty, that always had enough food for anybody who came to it. Anybody who dipped a spear into it would pull out a joint of meat, and it would never run empty in any company, which I think is also really interesting, because I do think cauldrons are kind of a yonic symbol. It's usually a very feminine symbol. So I think there's something really interesting about the way that the Dagda, who's this great all-rounder god who's excellent at everything and also has a huge part of the characterization is about seduction and sexuality. He's also got a very, very, very phallic symbol, a very masculine symbol in the club, and a very, very sort of classically feminine symbol in the cauldron, which probably leads me directly into my second rant of this episode. Because look, when I'm looking at the Dagda and I'm looking at the symbols of the Dagda and I'm looking at the character of the Dagda, there's something interesting going on there with gender, okay? And anytime I raise that, I feel braced for people to jump down my throat and go, you can't put modern ideas of gender and sexuality onto characters in ancient mythology. And I agree with that. Fundamentally, I very much agree with that. I think I just come to a different conclusion to a lot of people when they say that. Because a lot of people, when they say that, go, you cannot put modern ideas of gender and sexuality onto characters in ancient mythology. Therefore, every single character in every single ancient mythology is straight and cis. And I don't want to think about it, and I don't want to be challenged about it. And I come to a different conclusion, which is we cannot put modern ideas of gender and sexuality onto characters in ancient mythology. Therefore, none of them are straight and none of them are cis. Because those ideas are very recent and very modern. So I think there's something really interesting going on with the Dagda in terms of gender, because I think he has a powerfully masculine and a powerfully feminine symbol and a sort of a transcendent symbol in the harp. And I think that's interesting. And I have no desire to draw a conclusion from that other than to go, Hey, isn't that interesting? Don't you think that's interesting? Must we always default to straight and cis? Can we be a little bit more interesting? That's my hope, anyway. After the second battle of Moytura, Lu was made the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann because Nuada of the Silver Arm abdicated after that battle, passed it on to Lu, and after Lu, it was the Dagda. The reason why he's kind of remembered as being the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann is that he was the king when the sons of Mill, or the Gaels, arrived in Ireland. The Gaels being a Celtic tribe. They did not consider themselves Celt. That was a modern label that we put on them much, much later. In most of the versions that I've heard, it wasn't actually the Dagda who was the king. It was a triple king, or it was a three kings called MacCool, MacKecht and MacGrania. But there are multiple versions of these stories. Some stories say that he was the one who assigned every Tuatha Dé Danann their individual she-mound. There's a whole story about that. You can find which she-mound went to which of the Eos she, the folk of the she. And it's a whole list of the Dagda sort of sorting them and bequeathing them and deciding who gets to go where and who gets to live where. Other sources say that that was Manannán Mac Lir and that was not in fact the Dagda. But, you know, we're talking about the Dagda in this video, so we'll say it was the Dagda. In the mythology, he is succeeded by Delbeth as king, so his reign does not last forever. None of these kings reign forever. So let me know. Have you heard about the Dagda? Had you heard about the Dagda before this? Had you heard any of those stories that I told about him? Had you heard some of those stories that I just told you weren't true? And how do you feel about that? Are you angry with me? I'm sorry. Let us know if you have any questions, if you have any ones that like you heard about and I didn't mention and you want to check that. Let me know what they are in the comments. If there's anything else from Irish folklore or mythology that you'd like us to explain, drop it in the comments. Any questions, anything like that. If you like this video, please like it, share it, send it to your friends, and we'll see you next time. You.